the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is a very powerful figure indeed. He's condemned efforts towards peace. He's called for the targeted killing of 30 or 40 people in Gaza every night. Now, that's deliberately provocative, and it's intended to throw down the gauntlet to Netanyahu so that he doesn't make any concessions at a time when he's electorally vulnerable. And the polls suggest that Netanyahu may well lose the election.
Yes.
So Ben-Gvir is really holding a pretty big stick over him.
This is The Times at 1 on Times Radio with Jo Coburn. So Tony Blair and Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, have met Hamas leaders in Cairo to discuss the 15-point peace plan for Gaza. They'll hold talks with Israeli officials in Jerusalem later in order to salvage a deal struck in October to end the war and rebuild the territory. The deal is at a critical stage, with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu rejecting the roadmap until Hamas disarms. Hamas says it won't disarm until Israel fulfills its ceasefire obligations. At stake is the future of around 2 million people in Gaza and the rebuilding of the area, which remains mostly under the control of Israeli forces. So what does that mean for negotiations going forward? Let's speak to Edmund Fitton-Brown, Middle East expert and former British ambassador to Yemen. Edmund Fitton-Brown, how large is the pressure on Netanyahu to agree to a deal?
I think the pressure is growing on him. It's a combination of factors. I mean, the Israelis pretty happy with the Board of Peace and the Gaza peace plan. The problem is that now that some practical steps have been put in front of them, they're uncomfortable. They feel that the sequencing is wrong. They feel that Hamas is being allowed to get away with a certain amount of procrastination and dissimulation, whilst Israel would have to make practical moves on the ground that would be verifiable. And they consider that that would put them at risk. Now, there are two things I think in play. On the one side, the US is probably influenced by working with the Turks, the Qataris, and the Egyptians as mediators. And that is, I think, pushing the US into a slightly softer position on Hamas. Meanwhile, what's happening in Israel, of course, is that you have an electoral timetable
Yes.
Elections on the 27th of October. And so Netanyahu is under intense political pressure.
What does that look like, though, that intense political pressure domestically in terms of his response to increasing pressure from outside Israel to try and agree to some sort of peace plan?
Well, Netanyahu feels the need to protect his right flank, and that's where the problem arises here. So there are some extreme hardliners in the coalition that Netanyahu put together when he last managed to return to power. And one of those, the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is a very powerful figure indeed. He's condemned efforts towards peace. He's called for the targeted killing of 30 or 40 people in Gaza every night. Now, that's deliberately provocative, and it's intended to throw down the gauntlet to Netanyahu so that he doesn't make any concessions at a time when he's electorally vulnerable. And the polls suggest that Netanyahu may well lose the election.
Yes.
So Ben-Gvir is really holding a pretty big stick over him.
But on the other hand, if public support is waning for Netanyahu, is there not an opportunity? I understand because of the system, into the political system in Israel, you need your coalition partners. But if support is waning and the public in Israel is looking to some sort of resolution in Gaza, that's before we get to the West Bank, is he torn in any way at perhaps looking at what is on the table here in terms of potential disarmament of Hamas?
I mean, I think he's slightly torn. The difficulty he has, of course, is that he can't move to the centre. If he moves to the centre, there won't be any potential partners, coalition partners who would work with him because, as you know, he had made himself extremely unpopular before the 7th of October 2023 with his assault on Israeli democracy and of trying to avoid his own legal accountability. And now, of course, you have layered on that his culpability in leaving Israel unprotected on the 7th of October 2023. So he's toxic. I don't think anybody from the left will partner with him. That means his only hope of holding on is to tack to the right.
Yes, I see. That is clear, I suppose, in terms of electoral support. What difference do you think the intervention, if you like, or attendance of Tony Blair will make?
I think Tony Blair is a helpful and serious figure. As you know, Nikolai Mladenov is also involved in this. Blair and Mladenov are a pretty good team. Blair obviously is much the higher caliber sort of political international statesman figure, but Mladenov is very much hands-on, somebody who's done a lot of sleeves rolled up work on the peace process over many, many years. And that's a pretty strong team, therefore, that's gone with Kushner. Blair, I think, has good credibility in Israel, as well as reasonably good credibility in parts of the Arab world. So I think this is, the idea is going to be to try to thread this needle in such a way that the Israelis get reassurance that they're not going to be blindsided and that Hamas's disarmament and Hamas's removal from power in Gaza is going to be real. But of course, persuading Netanyahu, that is one thing, but also persuading people in the electorate who support Netanyahu because he's a hardliner, that any concessions Netanyahu makes now are not being made under international pressure. That's difficult.
Edmund Fitton-Brown, thank you very much for talking to us, Middle East expert and former British ambassador to Yemen.